Hey there, it's Irene Lyon. Welcome to this video, this YouTube channel, and to this long form interview with Kathy Kain. Kathy is one of my mentors. She's a colleague, and I met her about 10 years ago when I was studying somatic experiencing. She, at the time, and still is, one of the senior faculty within the Somatic Experiencing Training Institute, and this is also known as SE for short. And this work, SC, was developed by Dr. Peter Levine. And in this interview, we go through her origin story, how she has gotten to where she is right now, teaching and training other practitioners to work with the human system, with the nervous system, with early trauma, developmental trauma. We talk about her recent book that just was launched called Nurturing Resilience. And this book she co-authors with another somatic experiencing colleague, another colleague of mine and mentor, Stephen Terrell. They really unpack in this book, and we talk about it in this interview, what early trauma is, what developmental trauma is, how it's different from simple shock trauma, and the pieces that are really essential to understand, not just as a practitioner, but as a client who might be healing from traumatic experience from way back when we were little, when we were in utero. We even talk about generational trauma in this talk. We talk about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, also known as the ACE study. We dive into a lot. We even talk about things that didn't get into this book and things that she wishes everybody knew that are in this book. Kathy is a wealth of information. She's practical, she's funny, she understands the human system and what it takes to heal at a very deep level due to her work in private practice and in teaching others like myself how to do this work with others. So welcome to this interview. Enjoy, take notes, and please leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Take care.
Hi. Good to see you.
You too. So thank you for being here in your crazy schedule.
I'm happy to do it. I get a little relief. I can just sit and be still for a bit.
I know. So I know you really well. The people watching this, some might know you because there might be colleagues of ours watching this. I would love to ask you this question, and that is, what is your elevator pitch? If you meet someone, like, when you're traveling, do you ever have that person that's like, oh, what do you do?
Yes, but it does, of course, depend on whether or not I want to keep talking to them.
So what do you say if you don't want to talk to someone? Now I'm really curious.
I'm a consultant for businesses. That's kind of like, that stops it right there. Especially if I say nonprofits. Nobody's interested for whatever reason.
All right.
But if it's someone I want to keep talking to, what I usually say, because this is kind of the bulk of what I'm doing these days, is that I work with a somatic focus on the treatment of somatic symptoms related to trauma. Because that's really what I'm doing each day. Is my area of specialty is not the psychology of trauma. Do a little bit, it's about the physiology of trauma, but for me it's more how trauma shows up in the body and how those symptoms are informative about how we work with trauma. So I tend to place myself there because that's what I can then talk about. So that's kind of my pitch. Nobody knows what that means if you're in the elevator, but hopefully for our population we do. So that's kind of how we do it.
Have you ever had someone then quiz you more on that? Like, oh, well, how do you do that?
Yeah, I think once or twice I've run into other people who have a similar kind of focus, and we have one of those informed conversations. But mostly what I end up doing is talking about someone's individual trauma, or, oh yeah, my aunt had this. And so we end up having those kind of conversations about it, which are pleasurable in their own way, because then you can help people understand a little bit more of what's happening for them. So yeah, occasionally it carries on.
Got it. So I know that you just got this book.
Yes.
So
everybody else just got it. It's been a very long process to get it there.
I'll bet. And I haven't read it yet, but in some ways I have read it by being in your trainings over the years.
Yeah, it actually really pretty much could just be a textbook for the trainings.
That's my thought when I was looking at the table of contents. How did this journey start? And, what would be your origin story in terms of your first real knowledge of, oh, there's this thing called trauma and we need to work with it.
Yeah.
And the second question to that, which is always, I think, an important question, is how do you define trauma? And I know that's
yeah, I would start with that. And it's really, in a way, that conversation is more about clients, because my typical client population has been what I think of as regular people rather than trained professionals. So some people have practices where a lot of the people that they see are in a way from their own profession and have a certain kind of knowledge base. Many of the people that I work with, they're kind of literally off the street, so to speak, that they don't have a pre-existing education about the body or somatics, for example. Trauma isn't even a psychological word for them. It's like physical trauma, like going to the ER kind of trauma. They don't even have a model for that big picture of traumatic stress. So my way of talking about things is very regular, with kind of regular language. So usually the way I'm talking about it to people is bad stuff that happens to people. Things that are really terrifying, things that feel overwhelming, that feel they're going to be impossible to either cope with in the moment or to recover from. And things that continue to act on the person over time, that they're not feeling like they recovered from them. That's actually probably a pretty close definition of trauma anyway, just without the fancy language. Because that's pretty much what it is that an event has occurred that has undermined the person's ability to integrate it into their sense of self and integrate it into their capacity to keep moving forward. So whatever the symptoms affiliated with that are, which could be more psychological, anxiety, that kind of thing, which is also physiological, or physical symptoms, or things like phobias. If they've had a car accident, now they're afraid to drive, and they're feeling that there's a kind of a before and after that event. And a little bit later, I think we'll talk about the difference between that kind of before-after shock trauma versus when trauma's been present from early on. They're going to be kind of different. So that's really the working definition that I'm using with clients, because I want to find, first of all, normal language that doesn't mean a special vocabulary, but also not scary language, because the technical language around trauma can feel so frightening for people that it's a kind of a pathology orientation. And I've actually had the experience with clients kind of rejecting it. That's not who I am. I'm not somebody who has that kind of like a disorder. I'm just somebody who's having difficulty recovering from something that happened in my life. So I tend to stay a little bit more away from that technical language, in part for that reason. I haven't found it so helpful with clients. With other professionals, yes, but with clients, not so much.
And it seems like a lot of those diagnoses occurred through the diagnostic manual for like that, in terms of needing to name something so that we can explain this symptom that a person has.
Well, here in the US, it's a little bit different in Canada, but still you have the same kind of system. Who's paying for it? And so sometimes the diagnosis is there because people have to figure out a way to code it for insurance purposes or compensation in some way. And so we need to name it in order to have somebody paying for the treatment of the thing. And many, many practitioners know it's an oversimplified naming of something, but they're kind of stuck with the system, and so you work within it.
You got to work with it.
We all kind of know those are the boundaries of it, but then that persists over time and ends up becoming the label that becomes a little bit more permanent or semi-permanent. And then to go back to the other question about my own trajectory, in a way, it's a little bit like the same thing, is that I was working as a practitioner as a body worker. And I had these particular categories of clients. I didn't really have a name for them. I just sort of recognized, this is one of these folks that's not going to respond in the usual way to my usual interventions. So I'd had this, I'd kind of created this idea of, okay, I don't know what is the thing that marks this person from the other, but I'd had to adapt my methods, because what was really clear to me is I was making them worse using my normal interventions.
And what were you two questions. What year, like when was that when you were just in the body work focus? Like were you?
That was back in the 80s.
80s.
Yeah. So probably in the early to mid 80s is where I first began to identify where in hindsight I could say, oh, those were people with trauma physiology on board, but I didn't know what I was seeing. And many body practitioners have had exactly the same experience, because we have pretty direct feedback with a psychological care provider. Sometimes the client has these existing conditions that get triggered by a lot of different things, and you may not know what is in response to your intervention versus what is the normal kind of trajectory of their symptoms.
Yeah.
For body care practitioners, that's often a more direct feedback. So with my clients, okay, they're having an increase of spasm, they're having sleep disturbance when they weren't, they're having anxiety when they weren't. And you start seeing that with multiple clients, which is what was happening for me. You start to realize it's something I'm doing. They're not showing up with these symptoms and the symptoms just kind of getting worse or better. They didn't have these symptoms to start with.
Oops.
Or not at this level, and now they're getting worse. And that's really the feedback loop that was happening for me, is that clearly there's something in common that these people have. It's not the injury, it's not their history, it's not the things that I would see could be, it's arising from them in them. It's something else they have in common that means they're responding to my interventions differently.
What you just said, it's not the injury. So often we think, they're coming to you because they've just, say, sprained their ankle.
Right.
And so we would, in our world, think, well, that's a trauma. And yet there's this other foundational piece that was similar across like a certain cohort of people that you were seeing.
That's right.
At what point, because I remember when I had my aha moment in 2008 when I was doing Feldenkrais, which is considered body work, and there was like a week where I was just, all these people were just coming in with things that I could not really help them with from the Feldenkraisian perspective. And they were all really willing to do the work, but there was just this, something wasn't moving. Or if it got moving, you would go back to that body part 20 minutes later and it would be stuck again.
Right.
Did you have like a time where you're like, okay, I got to find this next piece?
It didn't actually happen like that. And I think that's mostly because I was teaching.
Okay.
So the thing, and this is a story that I tell all the time, so anyone who's had classes with me will have heard it. This thing that happens when you travel is you are automatically the expert from out of town, whether that's true or not. And I was traveling a lot and teaching starting in about 1986. I was traveling more than I was staying in one place. And so you come into town. As a body worker, one of the things that happens is people bring their clients to you and they're going to sit in on the session while you work with their client. It's kind of like a consultation version for body workers. And so who are you seeing? But everybody's most difficult clients. And so what I started realizing is everybody's most difficult clients are the same as my most difficult clients. They have this thing in common. And so I just got forced to figure out how to work differently with this category of person. And then I began to be known for having this expertise for working with challenging clients, never with the word trauma affiliated with it, because in the bodywork world at that time, that was totally separate, but really more like, oh, those clients, that you make them worse. Kathy works really well with those people. So pretty soon, my whole practice was kind of made up of these kind of clients that people had difficulty getting results with. And I developed these kind of methods of figuring it out, which later I could see were quite consistent with what you have to do when you're working with trauma, which is work in small increments and work slowly and have a longer feedback loop before you know if your intervention was effective, these kind of things. And then while that was happening, two other things were happening. I was teaching in a somatic psychology program in Australia. We had programs in various cities. And my job was to teach these budding psychotherapists how to do body orientation touch work in the context of psychotherapy. And that started exposing me to these other kind of conversations about this interplay between what our culture has traditionally separated of psychology and the body. Because my job was to help people see them in the same place. What's happening psychologically, emotionally isn't different than what's happening in the body. So then, when in my teaching, I'm doing this all of the time. And then also I already knew Peter Levine because I met him when he came to a bodywork workshop that I did somewhere in the 80s. We can't remember how long ago it was now. And so he suggested that I should be teaching in his program because he felt like this information about engaging at the body level was very consistent with what he was doing. Mm-hmm. And then that caused me to attend the somatic experiencing training. This would have been in the early 90s at that point, because I figured, I need the vocabulary, I want to know what the model is. And in a way, that was my aha moment, because now I had a name for the thing I'd been seeing. It's like, oh, this would have been helpful to know before now. This is trauma, and the effect of trauma is the thing that I'm seeing that's different for these clients. Yeah. They didn't just have a car accident. They didn't just hurt their back. That happened in the context of either pre-existing trauma, which then made it worse, or had traumatic stress affiliated with it, like a very challenging motor vehicle accident where there were severe injuries. And now I see these things of the person not being able or willing to drive, that kind of thing. So then it kind of crossed over, and that was not so much an aha moment as a sort of dawning over a year or two of, I now get everything in one place. Yeah. I have a name for it and a kind of model for it. I have a way to understand the symptoms that I'm seeing. I already have these useful, helpful ways to work with it, but now I have more tools that both help me understand why and give me additional methods for doing the same thing. And then it just kind of blossomed into being, I think of it as being all in one place. I didn't have these separate bodywork version of things, trauma version of things, psychotherapy version of things. They all started living in one place as this body orientation for understanding trauma, also in the context of teaching it. So what are the things that are important for people to know about this from these different modalities? Because I was still teaching in the somatic psychotherapy programs, and I was still teaching to body workers. So it really helped me see we've got at least slightly different needs, but not completely different needs. There's this big picture that they really need to understand, no matter which field they're really working in. And then it sort of came forward from there as this integrated way of looking at it. So that was from that, mid 80s into the mid 90s. So it was really more like a 10-year slow integration of understanding and developing the knowledge base in each of these areas to be able to know what I was seeing in each little piece of it. That where does the trauma physiology piece fit with what I was feeling in people's bodies, for example? That's not a psychotherapy question. No. It's maybe a somatic psychotherapy question, but it's more like a body question of how do I feel this, notice this in physical symptoms, in the tissues in their body. I'm not a psychotherapist. I am very clear around my scope of practice with that. So I'm not looking for psychological symptoms or relational symptoms or emotional symptoms. They might be a piece of the mix that adds and sort of bolsters my understanding, but it's not the framework that I'm working in. So I have to know what are the other symptoms that do fit in my scope of practice that are about pain, immobility, the kind of things that with a body orientation that would give you information to say something's not working the way that it should here for this person.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but Peter studied bodywork. Was he in Rolfing long?
Peter was a bodywork junkie. I mean, what has he not studied? I know he really started when he was teaching at a very strong affiliation with the Rolfing community. Yeah. But he took classes with me in orthobionomy. I know he studied other things. He's knowledgeable about homeopathy. Yeah. So he has an extremely broad knowledge base. And I think you see that integration in his understanding and his methods. And his body orientation was always there in the work that later became somatic experiencing. I think when I met him, I don't know that it even had a name yet. Yeah. But that body orientation was always there. And that's really where we kind of met and crossed over, was that understanding. I mean, it's called somatic experiencing, not brain experiencing or, cortex experiencing. It's right in the name that it's a somatic orientation. So that was our place where we definitely kind of got each other of the body is important here. It's not like a secondary added in later, but it's a critical element about what's going awry in terms of trauma.
So if we think about the body and the nervous system, when I was learning SE with Steve Hoskinson, the term he would say is trauma is nervous system dysregulation. And that is clean, I think, in a way of describing it. If we look at the people, so we'll dive into kind of that idea of early trauma. If we kind of go back to the book and what you and Steve Terrell, because we need to mention Steve here as well, Steve Terrell, not Steve Hoskinson, what distinguishes the physiology of someone, those people who weren't responding in the same way, who had that earlier traumatic kind of milieu, if you will, in their bodies? So what is the difference within those people? And then the other thing, and we'll unpack this, is a lot of people will say to me, well, I didn't have trauma, but I've got all these, we'll just name them fibromyalgia, chronic pain, insomnia, sleep disorders, autoimmune, which fit into that category of what we would call syndromal. And then the person's like, well, I had a house and mom and dad fed me and I wasn't hit, I wasn't abused. And of course that also is early trauma. But then there's this other subset where there's like this confusion because they don't know why their system is dysregulated. So could you speak to that, the differences in early trauma? I mean, there's so many categories, what that could be, but what's your way of describing that to people?
Well, there's two layers here in that same question. So the first piece of it of, I don't have trauma in my own history, and yet I have these symptoms.
Yeah.
Let's say that that's actually true. It's not that they are misunderstanding what trauma is and they've actually been neglected or abused and they don't recognize that as being trauma. Let's just say it's actually true that they had either a completely benign upbringing or a really supportive and helpful upbringing, but they have these symptoms. What we now know with intergenerational trauma and the epigenetic research is measurably for at minimum 3 generations, you will see an impact of the previous generation's trauma. So we know, for example, people who are children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors will be more prone to things like anxiety and some of these same health issues, fibromyalgia, autoimmune issues, as a result of their ancestors' trauma. So you could just simply be seeing either what I call, and I can say this because my family has this, genetically unfortunate, is like sometimes people just get loaded in genetically with these predispositions for things that get triggered by something that isn't trauma, toxicity in their environment, or the genes just get triggered to express in that way.
So it's like in the DNA, essentially.
And the expression of the DNA.
That's the key, that it is expressed.
Right. Yeah. Or they had ancestors that were exposed to trauma. And now they get to live out the results of that to whatever degree. We're still asking the questions about how much we can reverse these processes, even when they didn't occur as a result of this person's lifetime, but previous lifetime. The mechanisms of it are just recently known and understood. So we'll see a big difference in terms of treatment in the next 10 to 20 years. So it's not like it's just permanently bad news, even if it turns out it's your ancestor that this came from. But we need to account for the fact that you could, in fact, have these symptoms, and either they're just genetically there and it's not related to trauma, or it's related to trauma that happened not with you, but with your ancestors. So that's one piece to kind of peel away a little bit. And then there's that other side of it, which says we may have so normalized difficulties in our early lives that we don't recognize them as trauma. Or they fit within a range that our culture says isn't trauma. Like I was in the hospital and being treated as an infant or a small child, and I was getting help. So why would that be trauma? There were all these really helpful people there. And what we miss is that being separated from their caregivers, being subjected to repeated medical procedures, having pain, those kind of things can themselves, because you have an immature little being there, can equal trauma, even though we don't hold it as trauma. We wouldn't objectively say it was traumatizing, is that we were saving this child's life, in fact, in efforts. And yet that ended up having that effect. So we can have people where, exactly as you're saying, they would say, I don't have any trauma in my life. And then you start asking them about, did you have early surgeries? Did you have like a parent who was ill and away for a long period of time? Or a parent that was in the military or in prison and you were really just sort of disrupted in your ability to bond? There's some things that we don't hold as obviously traumatic that could end up having an effect. You could have like the best parents in the world. Yeah. And your family stories say all of that, but there could have been interruptions in that had a tremendous impact on you that would then show up with these kind of symptoms.
Yeah.
So the difference, to come back to that one little piece of the question, and I would also come back to the idea that trauma is in the nervous system as being helpful but oversimplified, because the nervous system isn't all that's going on or all that's developing. Yeah. Our immune system, we wouldn't see trauma symptoms in other systems than the nervous system if trauma was only about the nervous system. Right. We see trauma symptoms related to the immune system, to other disorders, inflammatory disorders like chronic inflammation in our blood vessels, for example, can be related to trauma histories. So we'd have to say that other physiological systems are included in both the expression of trauma and receiving the impact of trauma. Yep. And that's even more true when we are developing as an organism, because we are immature. We don't have a brain that lets us hold the information in what we would think of as memory in the normal way of doing it. We're going to hold it in more somatic body memory, not a kind of a cortical cognitive narrative. It's going to be in a somatic narrative. And also it has the possibility of kicking the development of those systems off the rails very early. Yes. So now you have someone who's physically developing in the context of the physiology of traumatic stress. And that is going to do things like turn on gene expressions that would not have been turned on otherwise. So now you may have someone who's predisposed to heart disease, predisposed to autoimmune, predisposed to anxiety disorders, right? And that's going to be different than somebody that had basically a healthy beginning. They're in their 20s, 30s, 40s. They have a challenging event, a car accident, or some other kind of thing that we might name as trauma. But they had a healthy beginning to fall back to. They had maturation of their physical systems in their brain in the context of healthy development. Children exposed to trauma, very, very young children, infants exposed to trauma, sometimes have smaller brains by the time they're in adolescence. Yeah. That's a profound impact from that trauma. And that's that difference, is those windows in early trauma, which is, technically depending who you're listening to and the defining of it.
What are people saying?
Yeah, 0 to 3, 0 meaning conception, because things that happen to the fetus also can be this sort of derailing process. So 0 to 3 years or 0 to 5 years old is technically the window we think of for what would be considered developmental trauma. That's a pretty big window for bad stuff to happen to you. Yeah. And just because bad stuff happened when you were 8 or 9, it doesn't mean that you also don't have really profound impact. Yeah. But in terms of how immature our physical systems are, and our brain and our relational capacities, because in those early windows we're dependent on our caregivers in a way that we won't be later in our lives. So if the caregiver is absent or the caregiver is abusive, we don't have access to them because we're in the hospital, something like that. It has a very different effect than if we're 12, 13, 14 years old. And those are those big differences between later shock trauma and early trauma. If we've got a healthy beginning and we have shock trauma, we can certainly have bad symptoms from it. And we can certainly see people's lives devastated by it. But with early trauma, everything develops in the context of trauma. The physical systems, the brain, to a degree at least, the personality, our capacity to be in relationship with other people. The trauma sort of permeates our life potentially in a different way. Yeah. Now, the good news is, which is part of what the book is about, it's a lot about helping people as clinicians identify trauma and the symptoms of developmental trauma so that they recognize them when they see them. But it's also really hopeful, because what we know is that some people are naturally born with a greater level of resilience. So even subjected to the same stressors as someone else, they won't have traumatic stress symptoms. Their brain will develop normally. They will be a healthy, robust person.
Yeah.
And even people with early challenge, given the right support, can develop a tremendous amount of resilience. And actually, recovery from trauma builds resilience. It makes more resilient people. When you overcome adversity, it actually increases your capacity to deal with later adversity. So I think it's, we can, when we're talking about trauma, it can start sounding really awful and hopeless.
Like, what's the point?
Yeah, that's right. But there's actually a tremendous amount of good news out there about the remedies for these things. It's more just talking about in the context of understanding it, so that if we're the one who has the symptoms, we have some context for why the symptoms are the way they are. And if we're a practitioner of some sort working with people, that we also get the context of why, they're not making these symptoms up. There's real reasons why they have these weird morphing pain syndromes, or, the coming and going of symptoms is one of the things that happens with trauma. And it can really make the person look like they're making things up, or they're a malingerer or something like that. Yeah. So part of it is to understand it, so that you're actually hearing and believing the person's report of the challenges that they've been living with.
It makes me think of a client I worked with quite a while ago, who had multiple vehicle accidents. So, and yet they weren't severe, these accidents.
Each of them individually, right?
Right. And so she came to me, and chronic pain, just horrible pain, anxiety, dread, fear, and really young as well, like very, very young, probably in the late 20s of her age. And the lawyer, the insurance, wanted to find something that would help, because nothing was helping. As we started to work together from a body work perspective with your work and Feldenkrais and Peter's components, the history started to come out.
Right.
And it didn't make sense to this person, because they did have a home and they did have food. And yet there was a lot of verbal abuse. There was a lot of toxic shame, something that we've learned about, and I'm not sure if that's in the book, but just very unsafe. Even though there was safety, it wasn't safe. And interestingly enough, there was a sibling that they had who was the defiant one, the one who was, just pissy and fought back and didn't take it from the parents. And my client was the one who tried to be perfect, and tried to, make sure that there was always things proper in the house and cleaning, and got all the good grades. Have you seen that difference in some of your clients, where they were they tried to be that perfect person? They tried to make sure that the reason I'm asking this is I think about management strategies and how people create what they need to stay safe in relationship. But in the attempt of doing that, they're actually harming their own physiology, but they have to, because it's the only thing they know how to do.
I mean, that's really, in a way, the horrible dilemma with developmental trauma. Is, I think you really nailed it, is that it's around safety. And it's like in the questionnaire for the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which has given us so much information about early trauma, it really is kind of an inventory of what I call safety and belonging. There's only a couple questions on there that are about physical bad things that happen to you, sexual abuse or being beaten or something. Most of them are about other forms of potential trauma. It could be absence of a caregiver, but also psychological, like
not being loved, not being.
That's right. Yeah. Feeling like nobody cares about you, that kind of thing. And so there is this sort of fundamental lack of safety that isn't because you're being beaten every day, but because you're maybe being ignored every day, or being punished in ways that, in a way, you could say weren't abusive, except it's so chronic that you end up with the kind of thing you're articulating is, I'm having to be so careful and spend so much of my time figuring out how to, in the somatic psychology training program that I used to teach in, we used to call it getting it right. So I'm putting all of my energy into getting it right enough that I'm not verbally shamed or abused in some way and told that I'm less than or whatever. So I'm working so hard to get it right, because that is my protective effort, is that it must be me, because who would think as a little kid that the adults would be chaotic? So
Totally.
You're thinking it's you. If I behave well enough, if I conform, if I make dinner, if I'm the one who cleans all the time, I get good grades, I get it right enough, that will give me that sense of safety and reassurance that I don't have. For some of us, either our character or we stumble upon it, what we do is we just fight hard.
Yeah.
We fight back, and I'm going to say, I'm going to take this stance, and we can look at this as attachment styles.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the stance that I don't really care what you say about me. I'm just not conforming, and I'm going to be the rebel and the nonconformist.
The black sheep of the family.
Which might be fine if that also then ends up driving our life all the time. It's not necessarily any more functional than trying to get it right and be the good person. If the rest of our life is spent rebelling against things just sort of habitually, either one can end up causing problems. Either one, you can still end up with traumatic stress symptoms. If someone stumbles on a strategy that isn't really harmful to the self, but actually builds the self. Or, and this is the thing that's hopeful and kind of curious, the main difference for children in developing resilience or not is an interested caregiver. The interested and supportive caregiver doesn't have to be the primary caregiver. So if that one kid in the family has a teacher or the parent of their friend that they spend time with, or somebody that's taking interest in them and being supportive of them and saying you're doing a good job and gives them that feeling of safety, they get at least a little bit inoculated against trauma. And sometimes it's just random. This kid in the household doesn't get it, and this kid has a friend whose parent is engaged in a way that they're offering kind of haven and shelter for that child, who gets just enough of that caring on board to then mean that they don't end up with those markers of early trauma.
Exactly.
So it's really hopeful in that any of the people that might be listening who are in those professions, school teachers or anybody like that, it's like, offer it when you can. Because what we know is some is better than none. So even a kind of a little bit from somebody, an auntie or even a sibling, it doesn't even have to be an adult, it can be a sibling in the household who's supportive, can make a big difference. And it can look really random, and maybe it is. You know, some of us are just, on the other end, genetically fortunate. We are somehow born with a predisposition towards resilience, and we will typically overcome any adversity, even in the same family, same exposures. That one kid has all of these other symptoms that relate to developmental trauma, the other kid doesn't. We seem to just see that there's some natural resilience that comes, the person has it on board. But just those little bits of exposure can make a big difference.
I think that's really important, because there are lots of teachers, there are lots of friends that, you know, people that have access and see children, and they can offer that little bit of spark of goodness.
That's right.
And it's that connection. And often I have seen the parents that are abusive verbally, but don't really think they are.
That's right.
But it's because of their own trauma, their own lack of connection when they were young. And so it's like the fish in a bowl of water. They don't know they're in the water. And then another person comes from the outside, and it's like, oh, this is a really harsh environment. What can we do to ease this pain, right?
Right.
I think it's really important to say that to people watching this who might be teachers and caregivers. It makes me think actually of Oprah Winfrey, out of all people, because she talks about how she had a very abusive upbringing, and it was a teacher that was her light, and gave her that sense of self-worth, and gave her that knowing that she is okay and that she's worth something.
That's right.
And I think that's really a good example of someone in the media who's talked about that openly.
That's right.
Right.
And I think you bring up another important point that is helpful for people to know, is that it may not be that that parent is actively abusive,
Yeah.
But you know from doing the workshops with me and Steve that one of the big areas of emphasis that we have in the work that we do is regulation.
Yes.
And we're meaning that the physiological version of regulation, not just the affect regulation, but really making sure that the person has the capacity in multiple systems and then hopefully out into relationship to regulate their own responses so that they're within a range that stays kind of workable and in context with the environment, so that we're not really running these huge amounts of stress physiology because the door slammed or something like that. What might be true is that that parent is just really, really dysregulated from their own history, and they're doing the best they can.
Totally.
If they're so dysregulated, and what's true as infants and very small children, we are dependent on our caregivers to help us regulate. There are external regulators in our earliest parts of development when we're physiologically unable to do that for ourselves. Yeah. So from early on, if we have a dysregulated caregiver, usually the parent, but not always, then we're not getting a lot of platform laid down for regulation. And then if that continues through our childhood and that parent doesn't figure out how to get more regulated, or we don't have access to other people in our system, social group of whatever sort, that are regulated, we just didn't get to learn it. And as you said, if everybody around us is like that, we don't even know that's what's happening. We don't even know there's a problem. Maybe we feel uncomfortable a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And we see other people around us, it's like they seem to be a little more at ease with what's happening.
Yeah.
It is like that fish in the water. It's that parent, if their grandparent and parent themselves were also dysregulated, they're going to behave with their kid the way they know how to behave. And we're going to get this passing on in the generations, this lack of foundational regulation.
Safety.
And then the nervous system is important. All these other physiological systems are really important because they're all tuning in the context of really what's meant to be short-term survival physiology. That's the other regular word I use with clients, is not trauma physiology, but survival physiology. It's a physiology we're meant to do when we're kind of running for our life or there's an emergency, and then we're meant to stop doing it. So at short term, we're good at that. Humans are really good at short-term stress, bang up into high arousal, run for our lives. Oh, that was good. Let's sit down and have a meal, you know?
Totally.
We're fabulous at that. What we're not good at is doing it all the time. You know, that little gazelle out there on the savannah. Humans would be dead if we were that nervous all day.
All the time. They wouldn't survive, the gazelles, because they would not be alert to the dangers in the same way.
That's right.
I want to tie that in because I know in your book you mentioned the ACE study, and you already mentioned adverse childhood experiences study, and this connection with, because I think it's really important what they found and how that connects to this constant ongoing stress chemistry in the body. And there's probably people listening to this that either know of someone or they work with people or they have these autoimmune chronic illness conditions. And I know that was like really your population of people when you were.
Those are my peeps, is how I would say it. Yeah.
And I'll definitely get Steve on. I'll talk to him at a separate time to talk about the kids and the parents, because I know parents often are like, oh my God, what have I done to my kid?
A lot of it's fixable. Don't feel bad.
All can be fixed. So for those that might be in that boat, I'll have that conversation with Steve. But for the people that are adults, I call them the big people, the adults, can you speak to like when you found out that the ACE study existed, was that like oh my goodness, thank God someone has
Absolutely. Yeah,
tell me about that.
I think for many of us in the physical care world, not just body workers, but medical care providers, we've known for a long time that there's a correlation between trauma and things like fibromyalgia, various autoimmune disorders, because we would see it in our practice all the time. But there was no data because the studies for traumatic stress were about psychological and emotional symptoms for the most part. There wasn't a lot of information about the side effects of motor vehicle accidents and other things we thought of as physical events in relation to trauma. In the last 10 years, a lot of that has blossomed and we have more of it, but go back 15 years, there was almost no study about trauma related to physical events even. The Adverse Childhood Experience Study came about actually in the Kaiser Permanente system, which is a health maintenance organization here in the US. And it was actually related to their weight loss program, because they're very proactive in terms of health lifestyle changes to make sure that your health isn't compromised by smoking and obesity and stuff. So they have all these really progressive programs like mindfulness programs and things like that. And so they had this weight loss program. And Dr. Folletti, and I'm blanking now on the other doctor that was involved in the program, he noticed that some of the people having the greatest success at weight loss were dropping out of the program and then regaining the weight. And so he decided to interview those people. And I think very much probably to his surprise, what he discovered is what they had in common was a trauma history. So they got more focused. I think it was 17,000 questionnaires. It was a lot that they ended up sending to their membership. And the thing about the Kaiser members is that typically it's a program here in the US that you get as a part of your employment. So very much in this population was white, middle class, employed, not the people that we would typically have named as having trauma per se. And yet they found that a very certain percentage of them, and an extremely high percentage that were failing in the weight loss program, had trauma histories. And so they started getting more focused in the collection of data. And over the course of however many years, the initial part of the study, it's now 20 years old or more, they began to make really, I think for the first time and at this large scale level with well-designed studies, a direct correlation between what we think of as psychological trauma and physical disease. And for those of us in the physical care world, it's like, thank you, Lordy. We finally have got some data to bolster this viewpoint that we've had, that it doesn't all hit your mind. You know, it doesn't all come out just as psychological, emotional issues when you have trauma. And as I said, the ACE questionnaire, the initial one was 8 questions. Now there's different ones that have a lot more, 10, 12, 15 questions. I think that maybe 2 of them, they're more about what we would consider psychological trauma. And yet what we clearly have now with the ACE study is psychological trauma turns on gene expression. So if you had a predisposition for things like diabetes, heart disease, emphysema, the exposure to early trauma can trigger that gene expression so that you then will manifest those diseases when you might not have if you hadn't been exposed to trauma. And then we get all these other things that just seem to arise out of that kind of dysregulation, is the way I would put it, as the trauma physiology, chronic inflammation, other physical disorders. And that's what was so shocking. And really, honestly, it hasn't been fully accepted into the broader medical treatment community. Not everybody knows about it yet, which is really a shame, because we can say now absolutely there's a very strong correlation between exposure to trauma early in our lives, and the ACE is the questionnaire covered 0 to 18 years. So they use a much broader range of their definition of in your childhood. They're going all the way through to 18. As a minor. It would be interesting to see what percentage of the people that said yes on those questions, it really happened when they were really young and maybe just persisted through their lifetime. I don't know if anyone's looked at it that closely, but we now know there is this direct correlation with what we've always categorized in our treatment culture as physical disorders. So now we've got them living in the same place, so to speak, is these things that we were separating out culturally as being psychological and emotional events. We can't really do that anymore. We still are in terms of delivery of care, but in terms of what we know now, we can't make psychological trauma separate from physical disease. They live in the same place. Psychological trauma for some people will give them physical symptoms and not give them psychological symptoms by the way our culture names those things. And that is new information for many care providers, is that this client with chronic inflammation, you may need to actually treat their early trauma more, I mean, yes, you have to treat whatever the physical disease or disorder is, but the origins of it may not be just about their physical self.
Yeah.
And that should be dramatically changing our treatment. It isn't yet everywhere. It is in some places, but we aren't quite there yet culturally to really make it real for us as care providers of whatever sort.
Mm-hmm.
That this person sitting in front of us, we need the inventory of all layers of the self.
Yeah.
Not just their brain and not just their body, but how they live as a whole being with all of those things being integrated.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that ACE study has done for us.
It's really done a lot. And I've watched some of Vincent Feliti's interviews, and I commend him for staying with it, because you can tell he's kind of got this, you'd think that this would just, you think that this many numbers would give people a hint. And I remember reading in the book Scared Sick, I think it is. I think that the researcher you were maybe looking for was Robert Anda.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
He was part of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, for a while. And then I guess he came across this research. He saw it. And I'll butcher this what he said, but he said when he saw the study and he saw the numbers, he started to cry, because knowing what he knows about where they focus on health initiatives in the United States, if we were to focus on this piece, all these troubles of heart disease and addiction and everything would just really be helped. So that I remember reading that and thinking, oh my goodness, like they know this information, and yet getting change to happen is very difficult at that political, medical level.
And it's even beyond that, because now there are many, many practitioners who are changing the vocabulary for personality disorders. So, and really naming it as untreated developmental trauma. And so that whole borderline narcissistic, some of these vocabularies now, in certain areas where they're trauma informed, they're essentially eliminating that and saying really what we're actually seeing is symptoms of untreated early trauma. So it's like not just on the physical side, you could just put this out here as a big funnel, is like that is where we end up if we start looking back in the history of people that it's also to do with violence. It's so many of the problems that happen in our culture, we can trace them back to early trauma, because the predisposition towards violence is one of the things that can be a side effect. That inability, the changes in your brain that means that you can't inhibit impulsiveness. There's so much that relates back to early trauma. And we'll get there. I know we're getting closer, but I can see if you've been in there from the beginning, as these researchers were, that it feels like it's already been forever and nobody's listening.
Totally.
Honestly, people are starting to listen now. So, I know about it now. And then we put it in this book. We have a whole chapter that's related to the ACE study and the significance of that. There's more and more data coming out there. So it's just, it's like changing course for a big ship. It's going to take a long time to change the public health system and the judicial system. There's a lot of different places that have to take up this information before we see significant differences. But it's certainly, there's more awareness than there used to be, certainly. And each one of us, if we take the opportunity, if you're a teacher and you educate your fellow teachers and the other members of the school to identify this child that has these symptoms, and you change your practices a bit more, that makes a difference. So if each person is able to just share some of that information when you're sitting with your medical care providers, ask them, do you know about the ACE study? If you don't, I'm sending you a link, because you should. It should be in part of the conversation that we have together here about my history and how my symptoms might be related to it. Then we can get the grassroots version of it.
Totally. Advocate for yourself. One thing that you often say when we are learning in your classes is that the brain is an end organ.
Yep.
And I think, to unpack that, we often say mental illness, mental health, people think of the brain. And of course, the brain is important. But when you hear that, or when you teach that to your students or people, what do you mean by the brain is an end organ?
Well, that actually comes from my colleague, Tony Richardson, who
Okay.
we included as in part of our thank yous in the book, because he's a psychiatrist. He was on the staff with me at the somatic psychology program that I taught in Australia. He lives in Australia. And even as a psychiatrist, that's how he holds it from he's a somatic therapist, a Buddhist, and it's all kind of mixed in together in the work that he does with his patients, and teaches at the one of the medical schools in Sydney, budding psychiatrist, which is so encouraging to me.
No
Teaching
kidding.
them. And that was the way he put it, is that he really thinks of the brain as an end organ. Our culture says the brain is in charge. And we operate as if that's just simply true, and it's the one giving instructions to everybody else in here, including to a degree the personality. And we have a lot of information that says that's not an accurate representation of how it works. We know from interoception, for example, which is the body's perception of its mostly internal, but its experience of the external world, that informs us about how we are and even who we are, is how I would put it. That the biggest, loudest organ in that is our digestive tract. And then the musculoskeletal system. A lot of the other physical systems are the ones that are informing us. And then they're sending a lot of information up to the brain to say, here's how you should understand your internal and external environment.
Right.
That isn't the brain being in charge. And what we do know with interoception research is we begin to act on it before we've cognitively parsed it out. So one of the common ones that we would use an example with interoception is what's referred to as the predictive use of interoception. And for most of us, there would be things like, I think I'm getting a cold. You know, you're starting to get sick. You feel these sensations that say, oh, it's stuffy and itchy and And so we're using our interoceptive information to say what's going to happen in the future. Well, we do that with things like safety, with other people's intentions. I feel this thing inside, and so that person must mean this towards me, or I wouldn't be feeling this way. So I feel nervous and I feel agitated and I feel not very safe. So I think that person over there is probably unsafe, and I'm just noticing that. And so I'm really good at noticing this person who's unsafe. Well, what if we're mistaken?
Right.
What if it's us feeling nervous? What if it's us somehow having a bad day about our environment, and now we're making all this meaning about it? That's not happening up in our brain. That's not our brain telling us. That's kind of that gut feeling informing us. So there's a lot that happens in the body that goes the other direction, that our brain does get busy making meaning about it. So our cortex is up there happy to say, it's that person over there that's unsafe. It's because I ate that thing that I'm having an allergic reaction to. It's because I'm in this environment and this isn't a known place to me, and so I'm unsafe. We're making lots of meaning about stuff based on information that's not coming from the brain.
Totally. And if the uniqueness of what your work has taught me, and I know all of my colleagues, is that, you're working with someone, and it's this apprenticeship, if you will, of learning, relearning, maybe learning for the first time how to be in that interoception and feel it accurately.
Right.
And getting out of the story. I mean, the story, you might let someone tell you their story, but it's like, okay, that's what happened, and then let's come back here. Right? And instead of let's unpack the story and try to figure it out with that cognition, it seems like it's really the difference in the work that you and Steve, and of course Peter, have kind of created, is this: the story is important, it happened. The meaning is important, because sometimes we have to make meaning, but we're really focusing on this internal quality.
That's right. And the way I talk about this with clients is we need to understand that sometimes we are an unreliable witness to our own experience.
Please expand on that.
Well, if we always are convinced that we're right about what we're noticing, then first of all, how do we make a change? How do we bring inquiry? I often feel like my role with people is to help them bring inquiry to things that feel just factual to them. And that processing of our own internal assessment of things without question is one of the places where we might need to bring inquiry. Mm-hmm. If I grew up in a really unsafe environment, my filters are pretty much set for noticing lack of safety. I have a really good danger map. My safety map is probably pretty small. Mm-hmm. I didn't have the opportunity to create a really big safety map. What are all the markers of when I'm safe? I probably have 1 million markers for when I'm unsafe. So if I'm working with someone like that, it's like, how are you going to notice safety when you encounter it?
Yeah.
Your filters are so heavily set for the unsafe things. We're trying to get to safety, and you don't know it when you feel it, when you see it, when you hear it, right? And so that's what I mean by being an unreliable witness, is your witnessing is predisposed, because you probably had to noticing where danger, how danger, what danger. It's all around danger. So the conversations you have with yourself are primarily going to be about danger, not about safety. It'll be about lack of safety, but not safety. So until we can find that recalibration in your self-vocabulary, say, how am I going to have the conversations with myself about when I feel safe, how I feel safe? Then I can get fancy and go out in the world and start saying, is this safe? Is that person safe? Is this environment? How do I feel? That's like advanced practice. If I can't first notice it inside of myself, then going out there, what's a conversation I'm going to have? It's going to be back to the default settings that I've spent my lifetime getting to know that vocabulary of lack of safety. And so my witnessing of my own experience is filtered through that. And there's very real reasons in the brain that that's happening. We tag experiences that we have a strong emotional response with, good, bad, indifferent. But if most of our early experiences were not good ones, we really flagged those. If I go searching to say, compare this experience to something I know from the past, which is effectively what we do, what am I going to find in the bins for the past? It's going to be the other bad stuff. It's like, oh yeah, that's similar. There were a lot of other things not similar. I was actually having fun and enjoying myself, but there was like a red coat in the corner or something. That when I went back into my files, I found that and said, uh-oh, so that must mean actually I'm unsafe, even though I was having a good time. And that's an exaggeration, but it's how our system works. We learn, the limbic learning says, this is what I know about this environment. And so then when I go into my referencing systems about that environment, I'm going to pick out the things that have been marked in my memory, that my little safety system has flagged it to say, pay attention, this is important. Well, if I've got 3 of them that say, pay attention because it's safe and fun, and I've got 5,000 that say there's dangerous things that you should be aware of, if I go searching, what am I going to find?
The danger.
Exactly. And so that's what I mean, is that I think I'm going back to truthful experience. But it's accumulated over time in such a way I filtered out also important information that wasn't survival necessary. And so it didn't get marked. It is that I had a birthday party where it was fun, but then afterwards we had a big family fight and I felt really unsafe. And I don't remember the birthday party anymore. I remember the fight. And that's where you talk to a sibling and they say, we had a fabulous birthday party. It was great. And I was like, no, that was the day we had that big fight and I thought Dad was leaving and right? Well, because our brain said flag the important piece, and the important piece for us was the survival one. So we filter out, without even knowing we're doing it, any of those things that might help us be a different witness for these experiences that are no longer actually like the ones we had when we were little and helpless and subject to other people's behaviors and wrath. We're grown up. Maybe now I'm a grown up and I'm able to take care of myself, but my referencing system hasn't caught up with me and isn't reflecting the actual capacities and skills that I really have. So I go inside and I find that little helpless person who feels afraid when someone raised their voice at me, instead of saying, stop talking to me like that. It's disrespectful. I'm not going to listen to you if you talk to me like that. See you later, right? And we might have every capacity in the world to do that, but we go back in our little system in there that says, I'm 3 years old and I feel unsafe, and we collapse and we can't advocate for ourselves.
Totally. And that goes back to that piece of the trauma physiology running the front of the bus.
That's right.
Right. And if that, a lot of the clients that I have, and you may have as well, have no memory of anything good. There's no childhood memories. And obviously something good must have happened at some point if they're here.
We hope so. I'm sure there's some people where that's basically not true. But
not true.
We hope that some good things happened.
But it might be nearly, if not impossible, for them to even remember that one piece because of this almost over-exaggerated map that they have. And it's not even that it's exaggerated, it's just that that's how it was built.
We needed a version of that for survival. We couldn't, when we can't take the risk to let our guard down, so to speak, then we're going to just keep flagging the danger signs because it's important for us in our survival in those moments.
Yeah.
The trouble is the way our system is built, it stacks on itself. Mm-hmm. So now we have the first 5 years, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and it starts to accumulate where even though now we might have more regular access to safety and people supporting us, it's all stacked on those early experiences that had to be calibrated towards survival, mm-hmm. and did sort of extinguish our access to the sense of the good things and the memories that would give us our markers to say, one of the questions I ask for people is, how do you know when you're safe? Or even, when's the last time you felt safe? And very often they're sitting there, and I know you have this experience going, I think once in 1997 it might have happened, and then they can tell you the specific circumstances because it was out of the ordinary for them to notice that feeling of being able to be safe.
Definitely.
Or they go back and say, I'm not sure if I ever have felt safe. Why would we expect that person to know the markers of it when it's happening? If they're sitting in your office, they're sitting in my office, things could happen. Planes could fly into the building. There could be things that happen. But basically, they're in a safe environment, and they can't answer the question because they're going back inside to say, so when was I last safe and how do I notice it? And their organism finds all of the other things that say, actually, fundamentally, the world's a dangerous place. And so don't let your guard down enough to notice that in this very moment, which we know is temporary, you're feeling safe. Because in the bigger picture, it's not actually very important. As you walk out the door, it won't be true anymore. Mm-hmm. So then you hear that they go in and they search, and basically they kind of come up empty, even though you're sitting there going, oh, this is a pretty safe environment, but they don't have a way to have it coded. Their search engine doesn't find that.
Exactly. It's not like written in the code, so to speak.
That's right.
It reminds me of this one individual I worked with ages ago before actually I got into the work that you and Steve teach, which forms the basis of your book here. And we were doing table work, and I asked the question, about safety, like how do you know when you're safe, and I said, because I was still young in my career, well, this room is safe,
right?
And her eyes darted to my door, and she's like, is that locked? And if it isn't, someone might come through there with a gun. And she was dead serious. Mm-hmm. And it really was a wake-up call. And I was like, wow, this poor physiology. And this was someone who had one of those car accidents, wasn't that bad, and then her life just spiraled. Turned out mother was very ill growing up, so couldn't care for her, and then all these so it was like perfect ACE study material, right. And it was textbook, but that safety was so not there. It wasn't even, and sadly, because of insurance, they wouldn't pay for the treatment because it wasn't peer reviewed and all of that at that point, at least. So, but that was my entry point into, not everyone just feels okay, even when they're in a room that's closed.
That's right. And I think that's something either for ourselves to understand that about ourselves, that this is not something we're just making up and we want to be this way. Mm-hmm. This is our system triggering that danger map because it just had to be so well formed. But also, as any kind of practitioner, to just recognize the underlying statement that's happening when someone says something like, is that door locked or whatever? And it could be the opposite. It's like, if that door's locked, I can't escape.
Totally.
Right? So we need to be attentive to their version of the safety or lack of safety experience. That's giving us really important information about that foundational lack of safety. We need to take it seriously. It's not like, well, it's a safe place and I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to go over and show them that the door is locked or unlocked, or it's like, you need to know that in order to have any possibility to settle enough for us to do our work. The safety issue has to be addressed. And when you're used to just either ignoring it because you're a busy practitioner of some sort, or this isn't really your client population, so you don't know that, it's very easy to override that. And of course, that person's going to feel, I didn't get seen, I'm not being taken seriously, and now I feel even less safe because this person isn't understanding that I'm safe here.
Totally.
It's not like I'm making this up, as my direct experience is going to be, I am unsafe here. You're trying to tell me I'm safe, but nothing in me is giving me that information. So as the practitioner, I need to respond accordingly and say, okay, I get it, that even though I've done my best to make a safe environment here, there isn't a way for you to be in that experience to the point that I can rely on it. So what else do I need to do to be helpful to you? Yeah. Check the door, close the window, what needs to happen? Sometimes there's nothing and we just kind of do our work, but sometimes it's simply, I just need some reassurance that I can let down enough for us to get somewhere in our work. And that I want to take seriously as a practitioner.
Definitely. And then that starts that connection, that attunement that they maybe were never given when they were young. You know,
it's a piece of the repair right there.
Exactly. And it's, you know, like even kids who maybe didn't want the door closed at night and they wanted the light on, and mom and dad are like, no, like your door's closed, the lights go off. Like, right? Little tiny things like that seem really innocuous can really impact our sense of comfort and safety with our caregivers, even though they don't even think twice about it.
That's right. And we may notice that if we have stressing events, we go a little bit backwards. So it wouldn't be shocking if, for example, with a client that had these kind of early histories and they'd been mostly recovered, and then they have some really stressing events. We saw this after 9/11, for example.
Right.
They're sleeping with the lights on again.
Yeah.
You know, they've dug their teddy bear out of the box in the back of the closet and they're sleeping with it again. The things that they needed to give them that sense of safety have been reawakened again because their like foundational sense of safety has been shaken again. And so they're back to needing the help of active reassurance instead of being able to just kind of rest into, I'm feeling okay. We would expect to see that with someone who had that sort of early challenge, not at all unheard of with later challenges that you feel like you go backwards for a little while. What we hope is that then there's a kind of natural recovery back out of it again. But I'm fully expecting to see that they're going to have to kind of re-evoke their management strategies, even though maybe it's been years since they left them behind. I'm always reassuring people that's just normal that we're going to do that. You know, this has been you've lost a loved one, you've lost your job, something has happened that really is again challenging that sense of survival or safety. We expect to see those early patterns come back again. And that might even be some of the physical symptoms they've left behind reawaken and show up. I thought I was done with these migraines. I haven't had a migraine in 5 years and now I'm having them every week again. You know?
Yeah, it really shows that system is very fluid and it's constantly, it has the potential to go both ways.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So if we think of treatment, and I know right now your main job is teaching people, you're not in your private practice anymore. What are you seeing as some of the more hopeful practices that people, we just talked about how someone can ensure someone feels safe in their practitioner room, their client room. I know you've got some pieces in the book that we won't go into completely because that'll take forever. But what are the tools that you go to 10 times out of 10 when someone comes and they have this kind of representation, this dysregulation, this I think the whole world is going to get me kind of physiology.
I think that really gets us back to the fundamentals that Steve Terrell would also talk about, is what we call regulation.
Yeah.
And I think that that's probably the hardest thing to get across to people, that when we say that, we really, really mean it. Because sometimes what people think is, oh, well, so I'll do like 2 or 3 sessions where I focus on what we're calling regulation, which is getting the person basically out of survival physiology, kind of on a regular basis, and getting them back into their window of tolerance, getting them back into the sort of natural, they can get activated and then they naturally deactivate. The way I put it with clients is you can have a little response and then you will stop having it naturally without us running around trying to do stuff to make you stop feeling too much and whatever. That your physiology, your system, even to a degree, your way of thinking holds within it this capacity to be triggered in some way, go into your response of whatever that is, and then come out of it again in a sort of a timely way, not 3 months from now. You know, hopefully even within the same day, but certainly within a kind of workable period of time. And neither Steve nor I are in a hurry to get on with other business with the client until that's on board. That might take a year or 2 with some people where we're not engaging that much in the way of content. I'm working as a body worker with content more as it informs our somatic work anyway, but even for psychotherapists, it means I may be staying away from the big trauma they came in with. So for me, it would be, I came in to work on a car accident, or I had the skiing thing. It's usually a physical trauma and they have these symptoms with it. And then as we work, it becomes apparent there was underlying trauma here before, and I don't see how this thing's going to clear up until we get to this lack of regulation. I'm leaving the car accident or the whatever alone for a really long time. And we may not actually have to get there because we focus our attention. And of course, I'm going to use my somatic method. So for me, the big one is the kidney adrenal. I'm working on this sort of regulation at the somatic level. How do they signal themselves physiologically and somatically? And can we interrupt the trauma-oriented, survival-oriented signaling so that they have access to resting? I call it settled, resting down, you know, having, when they're lying down and they're relaxed, they're lying down and they're relaxed. They're not jumpy and anxious. And that's probably the main frustration that I have, is that people are making good progress in their work by either as the client or as the practitioner by focusing on regulation. And then I think maybe the pressures come in for those of us as a practitioner to say, I should be doing more than this. I should be applying all these really great tools. I spent so much money learning and so much time learning. And then they start messing stuff up because they're too quickly challenging this person's physiology and their system, so to speak. And what's going to happen is that we will revert back to those old survival methods because we're back to feeling unsafe again.
And that goes back to what you said when we started talking a while ago, an hour ago, when you were doing your body work, you were making these people worse.
That's right.
Right. And it's this, right? So this has come nicely full circle, is that you didn't have that lens yet, which was not your fault, but you just didn't have it. And they needed this regulation work before you worked on the broken bone or whatever.
And they needed me to be working in smaller increments. I'm getting in there like furniture moving. At that point, I was working more like a body worker. And so I'm getting in there. It's like they have a range of motion issue. They're having pain. They have this injury they're recovering from. And I'm in there going, let's fix that thing. Not accounting for how much that's frightening them and asking their system to do something new and different, you know, that it's without knowing I'm doing it, I'm bringing actually a bigger challenge with them. And I'm just moving way too fast for what they can tolerate.
And they might not even know that it's frightening them.
That's right. Because they're in there going, I want to fix this and I want to be out of pain. And they're in there at the same level that I am, saying, let's get down to business and do this work. And what we need to do is back up and slow down and start getting the capacity on board to be responsive to my interventions without reactive.
Definitely.
experiences. So we need it to happen within the loop that stays within that window of tolerance for them, or I'm going to just provoke their management strategies.
Exactly.
That's the basic model that Steve and I are working with, is we have to find a way to stay within the range that's workable, genuinely workable, which is frustrating because, of course, they want to move more quickly too.
You can't.
But we have to be within what's actually workable for them, or we will just provoke that safety system to say, I got to do something here because I'm now starting to feel, again, that survival physiology taking over and telling me that this is not okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we're having to be sort of stuck within that range.
Yeah.
But then if we stay within that range for a good extended period, very often the trauma pieces have lifted quite a bit anyway, and there's much less work to do later in the process.
I've had that experience. It's sort of like the capacity, the regulation, the less fear is less. And because the system wants to get rid of those trauma pieces, those shock traumas,
that's right.
It kind of just happens. It might need a little bit of help, but nowhere near the type of help if there wasn't that larger capacity to be with the stress response, right?
Well, and sometimes we come back around. So again, using a car accident as an example, and now we've spent our time doing the regulation work, and it doesn't mean we aren't doing something for the injuries if we're in the injury recovery world. Mm-hmm. So I'm doing that, but I'm doing it slowly and in a way that doesn't overwhelm the person. And sometimes we come back around, it's like, great, we've got all the tools in place, and now we're going to do the accident, and they're not having symptoms anymore. And it's like, okay, well, we can try it, but, it doesn't bother me, and I realize I'm driving again, and I'm not feeling afraid when I'm driving, and I'm not having that pain anymore, and a lot of their symptoms have actually cleared up, and then we have this little bit of cleanup work to do with something that's still left that maybe we missed in the other part of that process. But most often, there's so much less to do in what we might think of. I always put, like quotations, trauma work, right? We think the trauma work is to work with the content piece of it. And again, this is one of the things that Peter brought forward, is it's not in the story. Yeah. It is in the way the story informs us, but the story doesn't tell us how much trauma is here. Mm-hmm. And the story isn't always the way through. It's really working at this somatic body level, nervous system level, however you want to put it, that gets that regulation back on board. And it's just that much more critical with someone who had developmental trauma, because in that process, we may be gaining for them the regulation they never actually had.
They never got, ever.
And I had that experience regularly with clients where after what they thought was the beginning of something specific like a car accident, and then we spend our time working, they're saying, I'm in better health than I was when I was in my 20s. And all these other things that I had before the accident, like sleep disturbance and anxiety, aren't happening for me. Yeah. Because now what we've done is we've also addressed some of the traumatic stress symptoms affiliated with their early trauma by focusing on regulation. Yeah. And they actually come out at the far end with better health, which is why I feel positive about even developmental trauma, or as we talked about also earlier, epigenetics. Yeah. If we get regulation on board, I think that goes a long way towards unwinding some of those, I call it the response system. We develop these response systems that are really organized around trauma. And when we start organizing around regulation instead of trauma, the response systems change. Yeah. Not 100%, we can't guarantee it. I would like to have my magic wand that could just make it all be different. Yeah. But certainly improvement, and certainly a response system that's less often provoked and doesn't provoke such big reactions, and that we recover more quickly. Those are certainly the things I expect to see that will be different.
Beautiful. It works. I know it
does. It works. I mean, we've tried it in the trenches and we know it works.
I have two final questions. In your book here, in Steve's book, what's the one thing in this book that you are the most, like, if someone, like, you have to read this book for this chapter, is there one in particular, like, this is, like, if everybody could know this, this would be good?
Well, it's actually two chapters related, because I think you can't understand the second one without the first.
Okay.
The main one that I really would want people to understand is what you and I have been talking about, is that if you're working with someone outside of their window of tolerance, outside of that range where they have access to regulation, you will simply be strengthening their management strategies, or what we're naming as defensive accommodations. And so that the chapter there, and of course I can't remember what chapter number it is, where we talk about what we got named as the faux window, the sort of pretend window of tolerance, where the client looks like they're doing okay, but they're only doing that because their management strategies are working so well that they're kind of pretending they're okay, even to themselves. So that model of having to work in smaller increments, and really, as you and I were just talking about, regulation, it has to be the thing that you're going for, or you will be constantly pushing those management strategies to be reasserted, and that's where you actually strengthen their symptoms.
Those patterns.
The best of intentions, you're trying to be helpful, but you're actually either strengthening or worsening their symptoms. And to really fully understand that information, you do need to have the ACE information and understand why that's so for someone with developmental trauma, to really understand how much we are altered as physical, relational, somatic, spiritual beings when we've been exposed to early trauma. It makes us really different. And as practitioners, we have to know that and really take that into account. And that second piece of it is then the side effect of that is this is not, you don't have slack, so to speak. When you're working with someone with developmental trauma, this is not a kind of a negotiable, have it there if you can kind of thing. It's the essential core work that you have to do, or you're just kind of doing Band-Aid stuff. You will certainly help people and you will see improvements, but in my experience, you will not see that foundational change that actually lifts those deeper symptoms that we see in the ACE material. Cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders, like the big symptoms that can kill you. That really dramatically impact your health. Those I don't see changing significantly unless we really figure out how to work within that window of tolerance. That's how those two chapters go together.
And I think, to bring this back to people watching again, it's kind of that common thing where you see someone who has been to so many practitioners, like 10, 20 people, and they might get better for a little while. And then, and I know you've talked about this, and they have this sense of agency because they've changed something, but then it just always comes back. And a lot of people feel absolutely broken. Like, what is wrong with me? Why? I've done so much. I've spent so much money. I eat like a saint. I do all these meditation practices and everything, and yet it still isn't getting better. And that's what you just said is this.
And it's the term that I use, and as you know, I have all these kind of vocabularies I've had to develop, is the person's ability to be a sponge. Is that you're doing all these good things, but you can't take them up. You're like that dry sponge on the side of the sink. You can't really take it up. And so what we need is that regulation that lets you absorb the usefulness, because all of those things are really useful. But they have to be able to sink in, and you have to make use of them. And if you come in after the fact, then it just goes more quickly, because it's not like that's 100% wasted. All of that good diet, all of that meditation practice, all of that good therapy, it's all actually probably had an effect that will be potentiated when regulation comes on board. And suddenly you'll feel like, wow, I'm actually feeling my energy come back up. And I feel like when I do that healthy diet, I take up my nutrients in a different way. It's like developmental trauma acts as this little membrane that keeps things from sinking in. So a lot of those practices are the very things you do need to do to help with your health. We just need to set the conditions for them to be effective for you. And that's really where the regulation work comes up underneath and kind of fills in and gives you that place to let all of that absorb and sink in to do its good work.
Definitely. So here's the next question. Is there anything in this book that you and Steve couldn't get into it that you wanted to?
You know, those of you who know our workshops will see that there's very little in there about the specific touch practices.
Yeah.
We did one little piece in one chapter,
Mm-hmm.
and that really just was a practical decision of, we can't write a 400-page book.
No.
And in order to do justice to the touch interventions, that's what was going to happen. And it felt like it could distract from this core topic. We felt like this information by itself is really necessary and important for a broad range of people. But as soon as we started putting a lot of touch interventions in, it started feeling like, ironically, it would narrow the appeal of the book to people who might otherwise pick it up.
Yeah.
So we just made a strategic decision. That'll be another book.
Cool.
And actually, in the second book that I've been working on with Elaine Duncan, which is called The Tao of Trauma, that I understand now it's available for pre-order also.
I think so.
It'll be out either at the end of this year or the start of next year. And a lot of those touch interventions are in that book. And so in some ways we sort of divided it up as like, oh, they're going to be there. And so we don't have to put them in this one. And then Elaine's been doing the same thing as, oh, well, you and Steve talked about that in your Nurturing Resilience book, so we don't have to do it here. And we kind of interestingly, because they were overlapping, you know why I've been busy now, working on both of them at the same time. We were able to do a little bit of that divided up thing. But that is one of the pieces that I think those folks who've taken workshops with us will probably miss a bit. Is like, where's all the touch stuff I thought I was going to get? Yeah, it'll have to just be in a later book.
That's why they just have to come to your trainings, Kathy.
Well, there's that, and it's, you know, there's an argument in favor of touch interventions needing to be learned in person also. But we did put some in there to just give people a little bit of a taste of it. But there was just, you know, it took as long as it took to write this book as it was. So it was like, it'll be a book 10 years from now if we try to put everything in.
Yeah. And I mean, all practices, medicine doesn't have one book. There's many.
That's right. That's right.
So, you know, you're off the hook, I think.
Yeah.
So cool. That's good to know. And for people watching who want to learn more, your site I will put under here. I'll put Steve's site. You teach internationally now. I know you're heading to Europe soon. I know you're
in less than a week, which I'm trying not to think about it.
You're going to Australia. I don't know if those trainings are all sold out, but
I don't know about the ones in Europe. The Australia trainings are full with waiting lists already, because I used to, of course, I taught for many years as in the somatic psychotherapy programs in Australia and did other workshops, but I haven't been going back very much. And so I think this will be the second time back in 10 years. Wow. And so there's a lot of built up interest in it, which is fun. I'd like to be able to have everybody in the classes who possibly wants to come, but I don't think I want to do a class with 100 people in it. So those are full, but I'm not sure about the programs in Europe at this point.
Well, time will tell.
That's right.
Time will tell. So I asked you a question before we talked today. So I sort of primed you for this.
You did.
I did. And the question, I'm not that mean. The question was, is there something that you are never asked when you do these interviews that you wish you were asked?
Well, there is a kind of a one. It's not so much the question. It's and we've actually touched on it more than would be typical, because it's one of those things that's a little bit seemingly on the boring side, which is about treatment planning. And I link that with informed consent, because very often for professionals, those two things are things you do and kind of set aside. But for me, they're a part of the alive process of education with the client. So constantly letting them know why we're doing what we're doing. And you and I have just had a kind of a conversation that's somewhat similar to the conversations I would have with clients, to give them the context of what is the purpose of our interventions. And then the treatment plan is us being alive with it to say, what are you noticing now? And what's different for you, and what's worked and what's not worked? And that is the way it's really critical for doing the changing and the recalibration that you and I talked about. Is if I'm not asking them what's working, what's not working, how do we need to change our plan, then I'm taking a little bit that outside expert role that has this treatment plan that I've talked with them about. And then we kind of refer to it every now and then, and we're, ticking the box that we did it.
Yeah.
But for me, it's so much more useful if I'm constantly coming back again from the perspective of safety. The informed consent thing for me is, and this is also from somebody else's material, from Sherry Sonnen Moe, who did the Ethics of Touch book a long time ago, but there's new editions of it. And it's that concept of truly informed consent rather than merely informed consent.
Oh.
And I think she may have taken that from someone else. So if I've misattributed to it, my apologies to whoever actually said it the first time. But it's that kind of concept that I want the person that I'm working with to be so well informed about why we're doing what we're doing. They already understand how and why they're going to feel uncomfortable, because it's a given with this kind of work. We're asking them to engage survival physiology.
Yes.
So I need them to know that they will probably be uncomfortable and why, and that they have the choice about when that happens and how, and if it doesn't. And then that is all in service to our bigger plan of how we're marching through this recovery process. Because if I don't have that, then the thing you and I just talked about of the focus on regulation, they have no idea why we're doing this. Like, I came in here for my accident to be figured out, and we spent like 6 months, and I'm like, where is our time to do the accident? If I haven't really informed them about the why of it and included a clear idea of how this here in the regulation work serves our purposes for the treatment over time and how we're going to get to your goal, I'm going to have a really restless client who's feeling like we're wasting time and we're doing unimportant work when the really important work is being held into the future. So for me, that's where, I don't know how you name that as a question, but it's that conversation about the client education piece and how, for me, it's absolutely critical to support the work that we need to do so that I'm not constantly having to convince the client of the importance for what we're doing. And they're right there with me. It's like we're working on it. They recognize their own successes when they have them. They come in and brag about their regulation capacities. Like, look what happened. This thing happened to me, and then I recovered. And I was thinking to myself, I have to tell Kathy this. It was so great. I got really anxious, and then I stopped being anxious only like 2 hours later. I couldn't believe it. You know? I want them celebrating their successes. And for me, that's all a piece of the educational process and the alive treatment informational process that should be happening mutually with the client all the time. So it's not so much a question, it's like that topic of the educational piece that for me is in no way separate from the overall reason we're doing what we're doing, and it bolsters their sense of safety, their sense of agency in determining their own future and how engaged they are in that. It's not me doing it to them, it's us together, and I'm the coach here. It's just helping them take ownership of their change process. And so it's embedded in the whole attitude around how I treat the client, how I talk to them, how I involve them in the process of the decision making. That is the form of them having repair and caring from someone that is mutual and respectful.
Yeah. Beautiful.
There you go. That's my answer.
No, education is really important. And I've shared stories with some of my people about meeting folks who work with the nervous system, but they fail to teach their students or their clients what that actually is, what the various responses are. And it leaves a person just sort of, it's sort of that sick model of health where you go to the doctor, they give you a pill, you leave, and you hope something changes.
And someone says, what's the pill for? And you say, I don't actually know. That's right.
And it's so like when someone comes and you're working with the kidney adrenals, it is important for them to know that. Otherwise, the person just thinks you're just sitting there.
That's right, having a nap or something.
But there's important stuff going on. And it kind of reminds me of that, the simplicity of just healthy attunement with the child.
That's right.
It's quite simple when it happens. Not a lot's going on, but when it's not happening, it kind of is a bit chaotic. So that there's something about that simplicity that you just said about it's this dynamic relationship. It isn't just you're the healer, they're the patient. That's right.
That's right. We're on this journey together, and I have hopefully some helpful information that will support them in getting where they want to go. And they're going to have to show up. It's not just me showing up and doing it for them. They also have to show up. And between the two of us, they're going to do the harder work.
Yes.
And I know that. So, and sometimes they're going to pay the price when we make a mistake. More often they are the one that, so they need to be aware of all of those things as they make their own decisions about how they engage their change process.
Definitely.
So
beautiful. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I think it's a good place to end. You are found on the internet. I will put all the stuff under wherever this video goes. And yeah, thank you for your time. Thank you for your work.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
We'll talk to you.
I always like to wave at the end because it.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathy.
Bye bye.